Alrighty, well on someone's channel there's always a lot of comments about painting and whatnot. So I'm going to teach all you noobs about painting. Now I'm not going to get really deeply into some of the advanced paints you can get, but I may briefly touch on them. But look, my grandfather's been a house painter, my uncle's a house painter, I've done house painting while in the building industry. I've spent a year and a half, actually just over, it's 19 months, in a spray painting apprenticeship, and also done several months of spray painting while working at air radiators. I've done sandblasting, I've heard about paints and experimental paints from chemical engineers who develop paints and stuff that you just wouldn't believe. You know, I've seen stuff that you guys would have trouble even fathoming how it would happen. Strange things like waterborne zinc and stuff like that. The chemical engineers talked about a paint they had that they developed as a bit of an experiment to see how fast they could get paint to dry. I'm not joking, they had the spray gun about 1.5 foot away from the steel. The only thing that was hitting the steel were dry paint flakes. You know, I've been in the biz, I know a couple of things. And so we're going to talk about some of these sort of things. Now, generally speaking, the way to paint steel and the paint used is different from the methods used with wood or plaster or whatever. With wood and plaster and whatnot, you know, it has a tendency to soak in some of the paint because it absorbs it. But most of the time, the paint technically is a form of plastic. And so you get things like acrylic, enamel, polyurethane, things that also have names of plastics. And basically, that's essentially what they are. With all this though, things such as plasterboard and wood will absorb the paint, and you end up finding that the paint that you use to paint your house, to paint your wood, your plaster, your tables, whatever, ends up usually being different from the stuff that's used to spray paint steel. Now, in some cases, you can be using it for both. Spray cans, usually you can. But you tend to find that it's a bit more advanced, a bit more technical, you know, and gives you better colours for the stuff that you put on the steel. It's not to say that you can't swap one between the other, because you can. But you'll tend to notice if you ever spray paint wood, not really brush paint it, but spray paint it, it just soaks the paint in, whereas steel won't do that. Now, generally with wood you can sand it. Steel, they use sandblasting. That's the proper way. There's a number of other methods you can use. You can use paint stripper. I wouldn't recommend it. It's blooming toxic crap. It costs too much, and you know, then you got to hope that you know, you get all the goop of the paint stripper off and it doesn't react with the paint you're using. You can sand steel, but due to the inconsistent shape of it, sometimes it's not the best option. There's another thing that can happen too, and this is sort of can happen with basically your angle grinder with your sanding disc on it, on a sponge pad. You can actually make it so that when you grind it, it's so blooming smooth that the paint won't key into it. Now, what I mean by key into it is grip into it. And what you're looking for is a surface profile, which means it's got to be minutely rough. A bit like really, really fine sandpaper. It's got to have that bit of coarseness to it to get the paint to stick. And sometimes if you sand it in the wrong way, or always in the one direction with a belt sander or something like that, it can end up sort of not really sticking, to be quite honest. You know, and there's some forms of paint where one isn't compatible with the other, so it won't stick. And I've seen a bloke who painted it in, what was it, inorganic zinc silicate, and then he spray painted your basic iron oxide red primer over the top. And he come along, and you could just literally stick your fingers on it and do, and the top layer was incompatible with the bottom layer, and it just come off in flakes, and we were literally just scraping handfuls of flakes off. It just wasn't going to bond. Now, sometimes between a coat of one type of paint and another type of paint, you give it a light sand. You don't sand the hell out of it, but you go along with fine paper and just give it just a nice little bit of a buff up to give it a bit of a surface profile, so the second layer of a different form of paint can key into it. I'm getting right on the technical stuff here. One thing I should mention is, in the basic stuff, you've got to get any form of oil out of paint. And steel is porous, but only just barely. Those of you who've been involved in guns will know that chrome molybdenum barrels tend not to absorb any lead or copper or whatever into them, whereas the other barrels will before they start fouling up again, sort of thing. And steel is porous, but only on a very microscopic sort of a scale, which means it can soak in oil, but you need to use degreaser to get it off. For the love of God, and I've seen this be a real problem at air radiators, don't spray paint when the degreaser is still wet. We never used degreaser during my apprenticeship, not once, not even once, because we bought thinners in such large quantities. We used to degrease with thinners. And then you could spray paint straight over the top, and it wouldn't matter if it was a little bit damp still, because that was the same stuff that you were pouring in to thin the paint. So what? With degreaser, it bubbles up and it turns to hell. I mean, it just bubbles up and you can scrape it off with your fingernail, and then it's all sort of half clammy and that underneath it. You want to make sure that the degreaser has got off something before you go ahead and use it. Now, I've also heard reports that you can use vinegar. And know somebody who tried it. Yeah, it works if you're willing to spend 2 days doing it. It's not worth it either. The best one of all is acetone, but that is a seriously, seriously nasty flammable chemical. You will feel your hands go numb, not with the breeze like you do when you have alcohol in your fingers and then, you know, the alcohol evaporating sort of cools your hands. Your hands go numb, I am pretty certain, because of the effect it has on your nerves if you use acetone without gloves. Having said that, I think nitrile gloves are about the only ones that acetone doesn't eat away, and even then they may still eat away, I'm not too sure. But almost all gloves, except leather gloves, will not survive acetone. And you are best with leather gloves when dealing with these sort of things. It'll eventually soak through the leather gloves, or leather gardening gloves with your fabric on the back and your leather on the front. But really speaking, thinners and acetone in particular eats away gloves pretty quick. And I mean, I've dealt with it before. They just blow up and just fall to bits, and you just fall off your hand. You know, they just flake off your hand. But you know, everything's got to be clean and dry and grease-free, and then you can get on and spray paint something. Now, there's different forms of spray guns. My favourite is the airless. That's because you don't end up with such a mist of paint in the air. I mean, I used to remember coming out the lunchroom door in my apprenticeship, and you'd walk into literally a cloud of paint hanging in the air. I mean, it was like a cloud. And you say, oh yeah, you know, but that'd just sort of fall. No, it'd just sort of hang there the whole time and keep hanging for another 10 minutes after it stopped painting, you know. You won't get that as much if you use an airless spray gun. Now, they're sort of a different beast. I've actually got one that's a cheapo one for house painting. And that's just a plug in the wall job, and I'm not joking, I can run it off my solar system, because that is how I painted the whole laundry storage shed, was with that thing plugged into my solar system. It's only 45 watts or something like that, 65 watts, something, it's not much at all. Now, your airless spray gun, technically speaking, it's almost like a garden mister. Some of them are. Obviously the nozzles are a little bit more high tech than that, and they're all made out of brass and stuff like that, brass or stainless steel or whatever. And essentially it's just like, well, like your little misters that you might spray your plants with, you know, your seedlings as they're coming up. It's basically one of them. And that's your airless spray gun. And they're nowhere near as common as what I'll call your conventional spray gun, which is your one that uses air. And you've got little air horns, which are basically, if you see the end of the spray gun, it's round, and then you got like these two little lumps that comes off. They're actually got holes in there, and then there's little holes on the side which blast out air. And you know, there's a couple beside the actual needle and seat that also blast at you, because you've got a needle in these things, and as you pull your trigger back, first your air comes on. Most triggers in conventional guns are like a two-stage trigger, and first it'll blow your air, and then you pull further and it blasts your paint. And you've got different ones on the back. I keep forgetting, I think it's your paint flow at the top, and I know your centre one is like a backstop for how far you can pull back your main trigger. And you know, like you wind that in and you can barely get it to pull back at all, and you wind out more and you can pull back, and it's to, you know, stop you from accidentally getting runs. And then often you got one at the bottom which controls your airflow, or it could be, I think it might be the one at the top controls the airflow and the one at the bottom controls the paint flow. But some spray guns you don't have the one at the bottom, you only got your one at the top, and good ones you have one at the bottom and the top. And either way, I forget what one's what, but you can control your paint flow and your airflow with those two taps. And yeah, they're conventional ones. They will give you what they call orange peel, which is where it sort of looks like it's sort of wrinkled, and that's because when the paint's still wet, the air obviously is blowing the paint on, but as it's been blowing it, it's sort of given it a wrinkly sort of a shape because of the air being blown on it. Which is just part of the side effect of spray painting with a conventional gun, that you're going to get that wrinkly look. And they call it orange peel. And yeah, that's just part of the dealio, generally speaking, using a conventional gun. It happens worse if you get closer, obviously. You know, as opposed to turn the paint pressure right up and then sort of, you know, and the air pressure, and then stand back a bit and then pull the trigger harder, you know. When you sort of start to run out of paint air pressure, yeah, if you run out of paint, it just starts misting. But when you run out of air pressure, you tend to get these two lines. And it seems that there's what you call your fan pattern, which is you blast the paint, you miss the paint that comes out of the end of the spray gun, is your fan pattern. And if you get those blocked air horns, like those air horns block up, the little air nozzles block up with paint, it'll stuff up the shape of it, and you'll be able to tell as you're spraying there's something not quite right, because it's supposed to be sort of like an oval shape, like a long oval. And when you have a drop in paint pressure because too many people are running off with one air compressor at once, basically you'll notice there's two straight lines on the edge of your fan. That turns from being a mist to just a big streak, and then you'll get bloody runs and stuff your job up. My recommendation, as soon as you can, just get a dry rag and just wipe your runs off. And if you do it quick enough, you may actually be able to save making a mess of it. And actually, another way is to quickly dab it. And then once your air pressure's back up, you've got to spray it again. But you basically got to get that off if you want to avoid having to re-sandblast the damn thing, but still have the job look nice. And I actually think, yeah, the dabbing is better than sort of wiping, because you sort of, but you got to get into it quick, real quick. And then you may sort of want to give it an extra second coat and maybe a third. You know, most paint, you've got to give it a second coat, and that's just the way it is. That's with house paint and that's with spray paint. But you may want to give it a third coat if you dab it, because sometimes you get little bits of fluff come off the rag and stick in there, and you'll still see it with a second coat. You give it a third coat, you might sort of hide those little fluffy bits that come off the rag with the third coat. Some of the little industry tricks here. What else was I going to say? Oh yeah, there's a hybrid one that's basically a conventional gun, but usually they use, when you get the old conventional guns, you've got a spray pot and you'll have like, I don't know, a couple of gallons or whatever in a pot, and it's got a big O-ring and you've got these things that you've got to tighten down, and then you turn the air on, it fills it up. And then it's basically like a giant aerosol can in regards to your pipe, goes to the bottom into your spray tin that's inside your pot because you put the tin of paint inside the pot, and then you plonk your top on, and that's got a big pipe that goes down which comes out, and then you've got your rubber hose on that which goes to your spray gun, and effectively it works just the same way as an aerosol can to feed your paint in, to give you pressurised paint. There is a hybrid one though that uses like a piston on piston setup, where you've got a piston set up one side, and then like a paint, like for the air to decompress from the air compressor, and that pushes a paint piston on the other side. And that, instead of using an aerosol method to force it up, it's basically getting, well, pumped up with a pump. And this pump is ran by almost like having a steam train engine hooked to your airline. And what that allows you to do is just have the spray gun sitting on a 20 litre or was it like 5 gallon tin of paint. And then you can, you know, lift the bugger up, just top up a bit more paint, and then, you know, keep going. You can also angle it correctly so that you can suck the last little bit out of the bottom and stuff like that. You know, and you literally, all the bloke needs to do is just stop spraying for a second, and somebody else who's been mixing the paint, put the thinners in, mix it up, just tell them to stop for a second. You can lift the blaster thing right out and pour it, the new 5 gallon tin, into the existing one he's already using, drop it back on, and then tell him to keep going. Not decompress, lose all your pressure, put it all back on. The air compressor's got to go to pressurise it and all that. What you can often actually do is just lift the top and slide it to one side. One person holds it and the other person refills with the paint as the third bloke spraying, and he won't ever need to stop at all. You know, and that's the hybrid systems. And they spray like a conventional gun, but they sort of use in bizarre sort of a steam engine concept to run a pump that gets the paint pressure up there. That's your real industry gear, and you won't see very many of them. You know, a lot of your older guys who have been, you know, car painters for years and whatnot, they don't sort of get into that stuff. But your production line stuff, your, you know, real heavy volume, go flat knacker, sort of people who don't just do one car and then let the paint set and then do another coat on the car and let it set. You know, the ones who just sort of are really slamming stuff out on an industrial scale, they use those ones. And they used a giant one of those air radiators that, I'm not joking, you drop it into what we call a 44 gallon, Americans call a 55 gallon drum. And I mean, it was built to plonk straight into a 55 gallon drum. We got the drums ordered with a cap in the middle, and you just bang, and we were literally had it all thinned and all ready to go, straight up, and we just drop the blooming thing, great big pipe on it, drop the thing into the entire drum, and off you go. And that drum would last you 2.5 days, and then, you know, you have to stop, forklift in, bang, shuffle the drum off, lift it out of one, into the next, and keep going, you know. And, yeah, that system was smart in the way. I think it even had a paint mixer in there that would continue to mix the paint in the drum as you were drawing it out. And what else was I going to say? Yeah, the cheapo man's way of doing it is to use you can use a sander, a normal wood sander. I wouldn't recommend it. The best way is to sort of try and burn the paint off, or wire brush it off, as Troy's done, and as I sort of done with the hot water system there. Burnt the paint off, and then I did actually use they call it a flat disc. It's like a whole heap of sandpaper all glued onto something that looks like an angle grinder grinding disc. And yeah, I used that in an angle grinder to basically sand off the bits I didn't get, and that didn't melt or get burnt basically, and then the burnt bits of paint come off with a wire brush. This whole idea of blowing it with your mouth or sweeping it off, forget it. You need an air compressor properly to get it off. What I'm all talking about here is primarily steel painting. Generally speaking, you don't really paint steel with a paintbrush. Yeah, Troy done that. Yeah, it does work. The job doesn't look terribly nice. It looks a bit liney and a bit crap, to be honest. Compared to a spray gun, it doesn't look very nice. It works, and I know of somebody, well, my uncle knew of somebody who done it to their car, and it doesn't give you a nice job. But if you need to get the job done and you got simple stuff, that's how you do it. Sandpaper, wire brush and a drill, and basically like a air compressor to blow it down. In all this, I might as well get onto the different grades of sandblasting, because there are different measures of sandblasting. There's what they call a whip blast, where you just quickly just throw it all over it and just basically make sure that sand touches everything. I should mention that sand's illegal in Australia because of the very rare occurrence of silicosis, which is the silica in the sand causes a lung disease similar to asbestosis. And all that law changed back in 2001, it was, yeah. And realistically speaking, sand's cheap, but if you do your sums, you can actually use your garnet 5 times more. You can use sand twice, but you can use garnet like 5 times before it turns to dust. And the amount that garnet will rip off compared to what sand will rip off, my boss worked it out. Most people used to use sand because it was cheap. My boss worked out the labour cost. You're actually better to use garnet because it lasts so much longer and you get the work done so much quicker. One man will do bucket loads more work, maybe 2.5-fold the work using garnet sort of thing as opposed to sand. If you want to know, yes, you can actually use beach sand, but there's some sort of I don't know what they do, if it's a powder No, I think it's something you add to the paint. I don't think it's a powder you put in the blast pot. I think it's something you add to the paint, and I can't really remember, but there's some way you can actually use beach sand with salt in it to sandblast boats. Is usually what it's used for sandblasting. Quite obviously steel boats, cargo ships and whatnot. But they do sandblast it with beach sand, and that's done. That's been done umpteen times. And I can't remember if it's something you add to the sandblasting pot to, that's what it's called, a sandblasting pot, to the to mix it in with the sand to null the corrosive effects of the salt, and salt is severely corrosive. It will cause pitting, usually speaking. We used to get things from wharves and that, and they're all pitted, and that was salt does that. You won't get that just having it out in the normal, well, you will after enough years, but generally speaking, if you see something that's badly pitted, it's usually salt that's caused that, or either that or it's damn old and being used in the normal on land, but for a very, very long time. And but with that, what we used to do is we used to leave it out in the rain, and you'd sandblast it and then leave it in the rain, sandblast again, leave it in the rain, and you'd end up sandblasting about 5 times. Leave it out in the rain like 4 times or something like that. And the salt would actually come out of the steel pores, out of the pores in the steel, and then you sandblast again. But you'd need sort of fresh water rained on it to get it to come out. And salt's it's a real bitch. Even to things like galvanising, salt's a real bitch. Now, speaking of that, galvanising is incredibly hard to get the paint to stay on a long time. If you sort of look at galvanising and touch, it's rough enough, I'll spray paint it. Expect the paint to actually fall off galvanising. You can sandblast, and I think sandblasting galvanising is about the only way you can realistically get paint to stick on it easily. But yeah, the old galvanising, it just doesn't like paint staying on it. And generally speaking, galvanised stuff is very good for making paint fall off. Zinc aluminum, however, which is commonly used here in Australia instead of galvanising now, instead of being zinc, it's a mix of zinc and aluminium. That loves paint. That takes it without a problem. I will mention that most new steel you can spray paint onto new zinc aluminum, and you can also spray paint onto colour bond, which is factory painted steel, usually roof sheets, or you can get flat sheets as well. Anyway, back to the grades of sandblasting. There's a whip blast where you just whack it over real quick. Now, that is as good as wire brushing it with a drill. A whip blast and a wire brushing, as they call it, are pretty much equal. There are machines that look like floor sanders, and my uncle's mate, who is an oil rigger, he has seen these used on oil rigs, and they're basically like a floor sander, but they're a whole heap of wire brushes, and they go along and they rip all the paint off, and then someone will be coming behind them with an air compressor blowing all the shit away, and then another, bloke coming behind with a spray gun sort of thing. And I should mention that if it ever starts raining, just drips a few drips, and it's not really raining, but it's just got a few drips, and you spray paint, you watch, you'll have the paint dry over the little raindrop on the steel, and then you can push that little bubble and it'll go, and the paint will crack and the water will squirt out the side. You don't want to do that, because that is it's useless basically, because the paint will actually film over the top of the, if you're spray painting it on, the paint will film over the top of the water and then just hold the water in there. And when somebody goes to walk on it or whatever, they'll stand on it and it'll pop it and it'll burst it. It's like a little blister almost, but you get the idea. But yeah, then there's your class 1, which is, where you get most of your reasonable rust and your crap off. And then there's class 2, where you get a bit serious. And there's sometimes they talk about class 2.5, which is getting really serious. And then there's class 3, where it's absolutely perfectly frosted and grey steel colour. Now, I should mention in all this, I obviously like doing a class 3. That's what you want in general, if you can. But that's, your bare metal, so to speak. But basically there's, what was I going to say? Mill scale, yeah. When you get steel, like I'm not talking just little bits of crap, I'm talking big beams, like the one that fell on my foot. I should show you my scar one day. We're talking I-beams here that they build warehouses with. We got the basement boiler room for a university, and then they gave us floors 11, 12 and 13 that we had to sandblast all the steel for. This was not on site, this was just come on the truck. And with these I-beams, you'll notice there's sort of it's sort of like a blue-grey, and it can be sort of shiny, and that's your mill scale. And that apparently is a layer of carbon that occurs on your steel when it goes from basically red hot to cool. And that stuff, that'll hang on to the ant. And you might see something that's got a class 2.5 blast, and there'll still be little bits of it still on there, just here and there. And a class 3, you get the whole lot off altogether. A little stunt I noticed is if you leave it outside and you basically leave it out there in the rain for about 3 weeks, it goes rusty, and then it starts to come off as flakes. And I used to be able to literally peel it off and hold it in my hand as a flake, that mill scale. So if you've seen that stuff, yeah, if you've gone and bought small I-beams to make up a large trailer or whatever, you would have seen that stuff on there. And that, yeah, it will literally come off as flakes. And it's especially good if you leave a big I-beam on the ground and you put a bit of wood on one end, a bit of wood on the other, and then it sort of gets a bit of a bow, and then a bit of rainwater builds up, and then you go and tip it over, and of course, if you put it inside, it'll, or the sun comes out, it'll dry a bit, and then you can literally just kick it off with your boots. And I used to walk up these beams, because these are big enough to walk up the middle of, and just kick chunks of it off, sort of thing. And, yeah, but I better touch on air compressors and what you can expect from your home workshop. Basically, your home workshop, you can't expect shit from it. If you're using one of those little $100 ones that you got from blimmin' Harbour Freight or Bunnings or something like that, don't expect that to actually bloody do anything. if you want a air compressor that's going to really go for it, you want something that's a large one, you know, and we're talking something that they can rate in cubic feet a minute that's reasonable, that's got a tank that's probably about 4 foot long or something like that. You know, we're talking single, double or triple piston. We're talking something that uses a 5 horsepower engine to run it, something like that, you know, something that's reasonable. That will run your spray gun. You hook it up to a little $100 job, you can forget it. It won't run it. You want to run your sandblasting unit? Oh, you can just about forget even using piston-based compressors. You know, often what they do is they get these big 3-phase units, and they're actually like a series of fans. They look like the inside of a blooming jet engine, or if you've ever seen a steam turbine from a power station, if you've ever seen photos of what they look like, that's what they look like inside. And they've just got a giant 3-phase engine that just spins it up, and that's the sort of stuff you sandblast with. Failing that, what you get is a trailer-mounted air compressor. I mean, I'm not all your triple piston 3-phase banger that's got a 5.5 foot long tank, forget it. You won't even run a sandblasting unit off that unless it's a sandblasting cabinet where it's like a tiny little sandblaster inside a box with your glove inserts and your little shatterproof glass and all that business. You might run one of those sandblasters off it, but you want a decent blooming, even a medium-ish, smallish size sandblaster. You need a good air compressor, and I'm talking something mounted on a trailer that's like a 4-cylinder diesel as a minimum. You know, we're talking big stuff. And, you know, some people have this mounted on the back of commercial Japanese trucks and go around with a sandblasting pot plus one of those air compressors and sandblast, and then use that same air compressor to run their spray gun. And, you know, they turn up at the fuel station, and the first thing they do is fill up the giant blasted air compressor and then fill up the truck and then go home for the night, you know. That sort of, you need dramatically big air compressors. We're talking trailer-mounted stuff if you want to use sandblast equipment. And I hate to say it, but, you know, you're going to need to get a serious air compressor for, you know, the sort that you can run about 4 ratchet guns, maybe 5 ratchet guns off, to run 1, possibly 2, but probably not even 2 spray guns. Now, where we were at sandblasting joint, that was a giant 3-phase. It was my job to turn it on every morning. That was one of my designated jobs as an apprentice, was to turn the air compressor on and turn the air compressor off, because the boss would keep forgetting to leave it on overnight. So that was my designated little job as an apprentice, was turning it on. And that was 3-phase, and it was a triple compressor 3-phase. I mean, a triple piston 3-phase is what I meant to say. That would run 2 spray guns. You put a 3rd spray gun on it, and one of the spray painters would start whinging because he was lagging. This is the thing, you know, you need a real, serious, honest to God, serious air compressor. So even if you've got a single piston one, you can't really, even if it's a 4 or 5 foot long tank and it's only single piston, you can't really expect to run 2 spray guns. That's a 1 spray gun machine. Well, you might need, you know, a double piston one to expect to use it. Another thing I noticed is your crappy ones that you get in your $20 blooming air compressor pack, you know, they come with like your little tyre filler gauge and your little crappy coil of hose, you know, that's only a few metres long, and your little blowdown gun, and they'll usually give you a little spray gun and that. Those things are absolutely useless. Those things, in my experience using those, they probably blow out about 4 times the amount of air as what an industrial one will. You know, so you end up wasting a lot of air by getting yourself one of those crap ones that's either $20 or comes in a $20 or $30 pack. You waste 4-fold the air, 6-fold, maybe even 8-fold the air that you waste if you go and spend $100 and get yourself a little one that's like, you know, a litre or 600 mil, and I prefer, they have car painting ones that feed from the top. Forget that, you want a bottom feeding one because you're liable to tip the damn paint out. And they got a little cap that stuff it. You want a bottom feeding one because they work just as well anyway. And usually the bottom feeding ones actually have a bigger head and can get more paint out than the top feeding ones because they tend to be smaller because they're used for more delicate jobs, so they only have a smaller fan pattern and a smaller needle, and they're just a smaller gun in general. So you get your little 1 litre pot one, but go and get yourself a $100 one, you know, at least like an $80 one, and they are liable to be a lot more efficient and not waste your air compressor air, you know, as you're doing your job. So you can actually get more paint on in, you know, 4 times the amount of paint on in the same amount of time with the same amount of air. So, yeah, I think that's a good little blurb on paint and whatnot. Respirators and that. There's some forms of paint like isocyanate. You want an air-fed mask with that stuff. There's other forms of paint where, you know, you should use a respirator. All this stuff saying that you've got to use a respirator to strip paint. No, it's best, you know, just to use a dust mask. You don't need to go... The difference between a respirator and a dust mask is a respirator takes out the chemicals over there. They've got carbon filters in them. I got one that I got a professional one that's better than the one I done in my apprenticeship. Same brand as what I used in my apprenticeship, but it's... With the new ones, they're good. With the old ones, you've actually got to get a breathing pattern going, because a lot of people find them sucking hard and then they've got a little pop piece in the bottom that pops in and out. As you breathe out, you can't just breathe out lightly. You've got to sort of... And you've got to sort of deliberately make your breath like... Not just sort of breathe out, it's sort of like you've got to sort of just do a blast and then stop. And because you've got to force this thing to open and then keep your breath out up to speed and then just stop. And you sort of, some people just can't handle it, you know, but my breathing patterns got used to it, and I used to even have it on sometimes when I didn't need to have it on. But your dust mask is only just dust, and your respirators have actually got your carbon filters and all that in there that take out your chemicals. There's usually rates of how many hours you're supposed to use it for. I will say one thing, and this is a very important point if you don't use it on a regular basis. You want some sort of a bucket, like with a sealing lid, like a nappy bucket or something like that. There's little ones you can get that are like 1 gallon buckets or whatever to use to, you know, soak blooming stuff in, you know, and they've got a lid that seals. You want one with a sealed lid. Otherwise, what happens is it draws crap out of the air, whether it's your mum mopping the kitchen floor with a bit of bleach, or you mopping the floor, or, I don't know, blooming detergents, perfume, that's a big one, scent of perfume. These filters will absorb that in, and you can have a filter that you only use once and it turns to shit, because it absorbs this stuff out of the surrounding air when you're not using it. So to enhance its life overnight, you should put it in, or when you store it, you should put it in an airtight bucket, a little 1 gallon. You get them from the dollar store and all that. I can get them from, any old Chinese junk store usually has them. And there's a brand I see here called Quadrant at all the cheapo Chinese stores, and they're quite a good brand, and that's the brand I use to keep mine in. But yeah, you can get different things to filter out different things. Some are for spray paint, some are for agricultural spray. The ones I had, I was working on chook farms, and the blasted ammonia from all the chook shit, when they're just about ready to send them out to the breeding farms or the abattoir or whatever, it gets really bad, and I just couldn't hack it there one day. I thought, stuff this, so I went in and bought the same brand that I used to have, but it's got a lighter pop-out valve, so you can breathe out really easy, and you can breathe in a lot easier. It's better than the older model I had during my apprenticeship. And also, instead of being rubber, it's actually a silicone outside. And the other thing is, you're really not supposed to have a beard when you're spray painting, because it's imperative that you get your seal tight around there. It doesn't have to be super tight, but if you can generally feel it if you're sucking air through it. And the other way is, you put your hand over your respirator, or you click your respirator, and your little outlet, you put your hand over, and you suck like hell. And if you can't suck in and it actually pulls your mask back on your face, that means your seal is tight. But your seal's got to be tight, otherwise it's almost pointless using it, you know. And like, we had a bloke come out who was a salesperson specifically for respirators, come to Air Radiators and tell everybody who spray painted all the knick-knack knocks, and he said he'd seen everything in the world he done to respirators. He actually saw one bloke drill a hole, or cut a little hole in the side of his respirator so he could fit his cigarette through the side to have a smoke while he was spray painting. I know of somebody else who used to do the exact same thing during my apprenticeship. That's pretty bloody stupid and sort of a bit dangerous, especially with any hot days and you got any fumes from paint thinners floating around. And the other thing which is really stupid that I saw in my apprenticeship was, with these 5-gallon drums, you can never, like the steel ones, you can never quite get the last bit out, just because of the way the cap's not right on the edge. And there's, oh, I've got to burn a few things, oh, I'll chuck this on. That was a very intelligent idea. A little bit of thinners in a closed 5-gallon tin on a bloody fire. Well, of course, before you knew it evaporated, then it hit flash point and then kaboom, exploded the blasted tin, and the bottom just unwrapped itself and blew to the shit out. But yeah, flammability issues, I might as well talk about that. Let's just put it like this, you don't want to test it. Paint in its wet form is terribly flammable. Thinners is very flammable. That's another thing, if you ever want to get off powder coating, that's actually the proper way to do it, is to dose it up with blooming thinners or acetone and chuck a match on it and burn the powder coating and then sandblast it, because it is very, very hard to just sandblast powder coating off at any reason. You either get it off, but you'll be there for a while, and it's more efficient time-wise to actually burn the powder coating and then sandblast it. But you know, a lot of these things are all flammable and they're toxic as all shit when they're burning, and you don't want to sort of have all that. Having said that, this whole idea of you got to wear a respirator, if you're doing one job, I wouldn't really worry about it. You can get past it. There's blokes who haven't worn respirators for 20 years and smoked, and they're still breathing without a problem, and they're 60 years old, and I knew these blokes, you know. So this whole idea you got to go and buy yourself a crazy big respirator just to do one spray job. If you're only spraying one car, whatever, don't worry about it. It's worse in a shed, because the fumes, if you're doing it outside and there's no wind, first of all, if there's wind, you will not be able to spray paint properly. Second of all, if there's no wind and you're outside, there's like a micro breeze that you will never get in an enclosed building. And it just, you never seem to form a cloud. It just sort of drifts off when you're outside. You don't get that same cloud effect as you do inside, you know, because you've got that gentle air movement. And you might be able to feel it against your skin, but that air is still moving at, you know, 1/6 of a mile an hour, and that's enough to clear the cloud. But yeah, you know, as for respirators, if you're doing one job, don't waste your money, go buy one. There's no real point in everybody, oh, you know, safety, Sally, blimmin', you know, you got it. No, you don't really. You know, blokes have, I used to see it with that old bloke who were saying he used to smoke and spray paint at the same time, and his respirator, yeah, the back, because you've got two straps, you've got one to go around the back of your neck, another one that sort of fits over the top of your head, and that's the good ones, and the crap ones have just got a little loop that goes above your ears. And he used to have that thing with the strap around his neck, but he'd have the top part off his head. He'd be laying on his chest, and he'd be spray painting with one hand while he's talking to me with a cigarette in the other hand. Between, you know, this bloke had been doing that for years. As one of the other blokes told me, God, his lungs must be like a burnt out old pair of leather gloves. But, you know, he hated respirators, and a lot of people hate it because they can't breathe, and there's other people that just don't see a point in them. You know, and he was a bit of an old hippie, and the other bloke goes, oh, I reckon he likes getting high off the paint fumes. Getting high off paint fumes generally didn't happen to me. It happened about twice. I don't know why it happened some days and not other days, but it only happened about twice that I've sort of, there's one time in particular I knew I was flipping high off the fumes. But generally speaking, it was never a problem for me. It shouldn't be a problem for you, but if you are getting high off it, obviously you've got too much exposure, and you should have a respirator on if you're getting high from the paint fumes. thing is, it just doesn't tend to get you high generally. But, you know, it has happened once or twice to me. One time in particular, I can remember it was definitely happening. And yeah, the day was a bit blurry. But anyway, I think that's a big enough blurb for you all. And yeah, there we go.